All right, so we're not always generating data in R from scratch, right? We're actually have data that's provided to us that we want to input. And more importantly, once we have our data that we've analyzed, we want it to produce an output file that someone else can load and do whatever they want with. So R works with many different formats. The basic one, and the one that we'll be working with most of the time, is a tab delimited text file. So this is normally a just typical regular text file with no special characters. Again, this is not something from Word or anything like that. That is separated by tabs. Now, in some programming languages, a tab means 4 spaces, but it is that tab button that you see on your keyboard. So that's called a TSV. The ASCII is a standard code. Basically, you know that these are the only strings that are allowed. So no special characters or anything like that. Just simple number of codes, text. So we also have the CSV, comma separated, that you've seen before, that you can produce from your Excel. There are packages that will now load Excel files, which is great. So you can actually tell it which worksheet and where you want to load the data from, and it loads it very nicely. So, but you have to install a special package to do that. But we can also connect to data sets that are from other commercial software. Any of these other statistical software packages that you might be familiar with. There's also XML. If any of you are familiar, this is something, a very common format to kind of use interchangeably, where you have tags that define where the values are, and it has some sort of structure that's defined. So R has XML parsers, but R can also connect to databases. And so you can actually connect to MySQL, SQLite, any type of these relational databases. You just have to install a simple package, and then you make the query to the database, and what you get back is essentially a data frame. And then once you have it as a data frame, you do whatever you want with it. Or you can create a data frame in R and tell the database to store it as a table, and it works very nicely going both directions. So again, we'll be working mostly with text files, and the command that we will use most of the time is called read.table. So this read.table takes a file and loads it into a data frame. Okay, why does it load it as a data frame? Well, remember, it doesn't want to assume that all the columns are of the same type. So the best way to load it is as if all of them are different data type. Even if they are the same, you can always convert it back to a matrix if you need to. By default, it will use white space. White space means just a regular space bar, no matter how big they are. But you can define the different separators. You can say it's a comma, it's a semicolon, it's a vertical bar, anything. You can tell it to remove any white spaces, extra white spaces at the end of the files, and you can also tell it whether the first row in that file is actually the name of the columns. That's always helpful. And you can also tell it which of those columns actually contains the row names. So these are, again, very helpful parameters that will allow you to load in the file easiest and simplest way possible. Now, this is only a select list of all the different options and I've chosen to select these is because these are the ones I've found to be the most helpful. You'll see later on that there are many different options, and you can see what the default values are for the different options. Now, underneath read.table, there is actually a scan command, and I'll be honest with you, I've never used scan because it's a lot more involved and you have to provide a lot more information. Scan is very helpful for loading in files that are not your standard matrix or regular file, like a data frame. Okay, so if you need something to be parsed of different sizes, scan is the one that does all the work underneath. But a lot of times when I read something in, read.table has worked for me, or I use a special package that reads that specific file that I'm trying to read in. So when you use scan, you have to define the different types of values that might be there, whether it should go all the way to the end, should it skip certain number of lines before it reaches, and so on. So again, this has a whole lot of options as well. Just like read.table, there's a read.csv. There's also read.delim. All of those read. Commands are essentially variations of read.table. Okay, so they have different defaults, they have different separators, all these different ways of reading in the file, but they all work essentially the same. So when you look at the help section of this read.table and read.csv, you'll see that they actually work in a very same way. Okay, so now you've read the data, we want to save the results, right? So the next one we use write.table. Now to write the table, again, the default is to just use a space as the separator, but you can tell it to be a tab or a comma, whatever you want. You can tell it whether the words should have quotes around it. This is important if your words have spaces in the middle, right? So because if your space is a delimiter and if your words have spaces, it's going to get all mixed up. So if you have words that have spaces, make sure it puts quotes around the words. And you can also tell it whether the row name should be printed as a separate column in your data, and whether the headers should be printed as well. So it has a little bit of control. It's basically reading in, but now you're reading it back out. Okay. Now again, RStudio, again, another reason why we're using RStudio, because it makes this part easier for us as well. So they have in your tab where the environment and history tab, there's a little option to import data sets. And when you click on that, it will ask you if you want to import from a text file or actual from a URL. When you click on the text file, then you will pick the file that you're interested in, and it will give you a quick summary of what it looks like in this file. It will give you a glimpse of what the data frame would look like if you were to load it in, and it gives you a lot of the options that I mentioned over here. So again, this interface is perfectly acceptable. Don't feel like you're cheating by using this interface. It's built into RStudio. But when you do use this, there is a command that comes out in the prompt. I highly recommend you save that command into your script so you remember how the data was loaded. Okay? Right, so some of the things that you can say is the heading is there. Use the first column. For the row names, the separator should be tab, and the decimal is a period. Now the distinction is that in some countries, a decimal is represented by a comma. So there is a distinction, and it knows about it, so you can actually tell it to load it that way.